no makeup, triangle hair, pajamas. Must mean it's time for a video. I love how when I started uploading again at the beginning of lockdown, like, I put so much effort in. I was like wearing nice shirts, I like had my hair nice, I had makeup on, you know, with like proper nice thought out content. And now it's winter, it's dark, it's later in the year, and this is what you get. I'm schlubby. This video should be nice and short and sweet because I read barely anything in November. I say that, I've got like, the pile's not too bad. I read like, what is it, 1, 2, 6.5 books, but 3 of those were very short graphic novels, and also the second book of the month I finished on like the 24th. So the first like 3 weeks of the month I read barely anything, and then I kind of binge read a lot of stuff in like the last few days of the month. So it was a bit uneven, a bit not great. Hopefully December is better and I'll try and hit my Goodreads reading goal for the end of the year and read some good books. The first book that I finished in November was Saltwater, and I low-key lied about this. I put this in my October wrap-up, being like, oh, I'm filming this October wrap-up early and I'm going to finish this book by the end of the month, so I'm just going to talk about it here. And I didn't finish that book by the end of October. November came, and then it was a week into November, and then nearly 2 weeks, and I still hadn't finished this, and I was like, that's embarrassing for you. So I actually talk about this in my NaNoWriMo vlog that I did, because it's low-key the style of writing that I kind of wanted to capture for the novel I was trying to write in Nano. And I really love the writing style of this. It follows Lucy, who is a university student, and she's moved from her more kind of rural-ish town of, I think, Sunderland, and then she moves to London for university, and she kind of gets eaten up in the big city and gets a bit disillusioned with the mass of the city and the friends that she's making, and she feels quite transient. I think that's quite a good word for it, because this story is very non-linear. So we start in London, then we flash back to the future where she's gone back to her hometown of Ireland, and that's very rural, and then we switch back to Sunderland, then back to London, and then we have little vignettes of like her family members, her mother, her grandmother, when they were young and when they were kind of her age and what they were like. So it's very much a transient novel. We're moving back in between timelines, we're moving back in between locations. It's very much just little vignettes, little snapshots of memory and little snapshots of feelings. It's very poetic. The writer herself is also a poet, and you can tell that from the writing style. It's very visual, it's very abstract, it's all about kind of images and thoughts and feelings and like the vibes, you know? I always find it so hard to talk about what I mean when I say I like this writing style, because so I just end up writing out page numbers that kind of capture what I mean. So I might just read you a little bit of what I mean. So this is on page 66 if anyone has a copy of this book and wants to follow along. For some reason, anyway. When the sun sets here, the clouds are edged in brown, as though they are fruit that has been left out for too long. I think that if love was a colour, then it would be brown. It is the colour of rust and rot and decay, of avocado spoiled by the passing of time, and of dirt and age and things that have been forgotten. It is the colour of tobacco and coffee, of soil and chocolate and whiskey, things that are delicious in a heavy, cloying way. When the tide is out and all the rocks are exposed, everything is brown. The seaweed rotting in the air, the mulchy seabed, the sky and the sea and the sand. It is a bruised, violent kind of beauty, and it seems to me that maybe that's what love is like in its purest form. Maybe it is no coincidence that bloodstains are brown, that dried up flaky residue that leaks from the heart. I also marked out 221, let's see what that one is. I was too full, I was brimming with the possibility of everything. Other people's lives were carefully curated, whereas I was the tangled knot of all the people and the places I had ever wanted to be. I was distracted by every bright thing and enamored with every person I met who promised a more solid version of myself. I like to learn. I had burst out of my own skin, but I hadn't grown a new one yet. All the tiny shards of myself were loose and drifting, caught with the dust on the roads, illuminated in car headlights. I watched as they landed in the gutter with a lazy sort of panic. I didn't know how to put myself back together. I can see why I marked that passage. Oof, yikes. But yeah, I think those two quotes really capture this novel for me. Poetic, heavy, raw, intimate, tasty. Visual, very visual. I like that about it. I like it a lot. The next read of the month was Mythos. And despite the fact that it took me like 3 weeks to read, I loved this book so much. I'm a die-hard Rick Riordan stan. I love the Percy Jackson books, and I've read all the spin-off series. Have to catch up on Trials of Apollo because that last book just came out. But this book is a wonderful, wonderful retelling of the Greek myths. And Greek myths are one of those things where like you've heard it before, but obviously all of the details have escaped you. So it's always so joyous when, you know, you discover them again and you remember little details, and whoever's retelling them adds certain little quips or funny moments. Obviously these stories didn't really happen. So every time someone retells them, they can add their own twists and their own interpretations. And what I love about this book in particular is it's just a sort of hybrid of fact and fiction. We get the wonderful myths, we get the wonderful stories. Stephen Fry tells them beautifully with his very dry English humour and his very funny kind of witticisms and his very like, I don't know how to describe it, just he's really great at storytelling. And I think if you've engaged with any of his work, you know, either on QI or like his acting work in, you know, Blackadder or Fry and Laurie, like you'll know his type of humour, and that's very much present in this book, and it was glorious, it was wonderful. But then also he talks about in relation to the myths, you know, where they came from, how different accounts and different commentators through history have interpreted them and have retold them. He definitely puts the myths in their context, and when he talks about people like Ariadne or Echo, obviously he talks about the fact that we get the word arachnid from Arachne, and we get the word Echo from the myth of Echo and Narcissus. So he very much puts the stories in their place and time, and I loved that. Instead of reading the physical copy, I actually listened a lot to the audiobook, simply because I was in a bit of a slump and finding it hard to kind of concentrate on books, so I put the audiobook on and was just kind of pottering around doing other things, and the audiobook is fantastic. Obviously anyone who knows Stephen Fry knows he's an actor as well as a writer and comedian and presenter and everything that he does amazingly. And he does all of the funny voices for all of the gods, and it's hilarious. I particularly enjoyed his audio version of the myth of Eros and Psyche, because he does the voices of like Psyche's jealous sisters when they're going around her cloud palace, and it's just very funny. And he just perfectly captures like the ludicrousness of some of these myths. You know, the Greek gods were dramatic and vengeful, and they loved violently, and they were vicious and mean. These myths are just so bursting with like fierce, fiery emotion, whether it's love, lust, or anger and hatred, and Stephen Fry perfectly captures like this dramatic, verbose language and these like huge characters so well. It's just so much fun, and I really recommend this for anyone who's a fan of Greek myths and just doesn't know where to start, because this is a very accessible, very enjoyable version of them. And there are myths that like explain why certain things in the world are the way they are. For example, the myth of Demeter and Persephone that explains why we have the seasons, or the myth of Phaeton using Apollo's sun chariot, and that's why we have the desert, because Phaeton crashes from the sun chariot. And I love myths like that that kind of try to explain why the world is the way it is and why it looks a certain way. But then there are also just random myths that kind of explain nothing. That's quite fun, and I guess those are less memorable because you're not like, oh yeah, that's linked to this and that's why we have time or whatever. But there are lots of just random myths that are just about the gods being stupid and about the gods being vengeful and about the gods being arrogant, and they're just quite fun, and I really recommend this. And then came a rather emotional moment for me in November where I finished up Giant Days. So I read volume 12, volume 13, and volume 14 of Giant Days, and I already miss my girls so much. Oh my god, is this the last time I'm going to talk about Giant Days on my channel? Because there'll be no more hauls and no more reviews. It's done. This was a strange mix for me because it was obviously quite sad to read because one of my favourite series in the world is ending, and also because it finishes with them graduating and it's about their anxiety about getting jobs and moving into the adult world. It obviously like made me a little bit sad because I've just graduated in summer, but I can't move on to the next stage yet. I can't, you know, get my first jobs in what I want to do because we're in a pandemic and my dad's high risk, so it severely limits the types of jobs that I can do and the type of thing that I can take on at the minute. So that made me quite sad, you know. I was like, oh, I want to be like, you know, finding my first adult steps into the world post-uni the way they are. But then it also made me quite excited because I still have all of that to come, you know. Life will go on, and in the meantime, you know, before life goes back to normal, I can live vicariously through the last issue of Giant Days. She's stunning. She's gorgeous. I love her. This is How the King of Elfhame Learned to Hate Stories by Holly Black. Queen Holly Black. So Holly Black's Cruel Prince series is one of my favourite fantasy series. It's just so much fun. It is the perfect mix of like world building and, you know, a believable world, but also just drama and political intrigue and backstabbing, and the characters are so vibrant and fun, and I just love watching the dynamics shift throughout the series. And the world building is there and the writing is beautiful, but it's not too heavy. Like, your girl doesn't want an info dump, you know? I'm not like a big high fantasy reader. I never read Game of Thrones, never read Brandon Sanderson, you know. I'm not one to get into like big 900-page books. The closest I got was Priory of the Orange Tree, and while I did enjoy that, you can read something just as good, but like with less of a time investment. Is that really mean to say? Like, I don't regret the time I spent reading Priory, but did the length of it add to my enjoyment of it? Probably not. I think I could have got the same enjoyment out of it had it been shorter. I don't know. I feel like I'm like spilling tea, and I don't want to spill tea. Like, that's a good book and this is a good book, and I feel bad comparing them, but anyway, this short story series collection thing was a little series following Cardan, who is obviously the Cruel Prince in the Cruel Prince series. He is a dastardly, delicious character who is, you know, that stereotypical bad boy who isn't really a bad boy, you know, bad boy with like a secret heart of gold, and then we love him. So this book was filled with stories following his childhood, and like little vignettes of him and Jude, and it has beautiful illustrations, and I loved it. There might be people disappointed with this that wanted more in the terms of plot, like wanted more kind of development of Cardan and like what happens to him and Jude after that series. But to be honest, I wasn't expecting that, so I wasn't disappointed. I just thought that these stories would flesh out Cardan as a character, and they did, and they were just kind of fun little vignettes, and I didn't really want much more than that. Obviously, I think anything important to that series is kind of already in that series, so we don't really need it here, if that makes sense. But I thought this was beautiful. It was stunning. I love the illustrations. I think they captured Cardan and this world perfectly, and it was just such a beautiful object, and I just love owning it. And I just kind of read this very quickly. I soaked it up in like a couple of hours, and then I regretted it because I was like, oh, I should have savoured that, and I wish I could read more of it. And then the last one's technically not part of my November wrap up because I haven't finished it yet, but I feel like I can talk about it because it's one I've already read anyway, so it will be technically listed in my December wrap up, but I'll just give you my thoughts here. And that's Wind in the Willows, and I'm reading this gorgeous illustrated edition, which you will have seen a lot of if you watched my audiobook for When Autumn Goes Away or something video that I just did. It was a very experimental video where I just had an old audiobook that I listened to of Wind in the Willows, and I paired it with like the illustrations in this book. And it was like a very slow, calming, trying to be aesthetic video to be like soothing and nice, but no one really watched it. So if you want to see more of the illustrations from this book, I will leave a link to that video in the description because you see quite a lot of the book in that video, and also you get to hear the story, which is nice. But yeah, I grew up listening to that audiobook of Wind in the Willows, the one that I used in my video, and when I started reading this, I realised that that was very much abridged. I think the plot is pretty much the same, but the audiobook is quite fast paced. The audiobook is only like an hour long, so everything happens quite quickly, and what I've enjoyed about reading the book is that it's slower, you know, it's more relaxing, it takes more time to describe the scenery and describe the characters and like set the scene. And there's a whole lovely scene that's not in the audiobook, where Rat and Mole go back to Mole's little cottage like halfway through the book. In the audiobook, obviously Mole leaves at the beginning and teams up with Rat and they go on this big adventure. But in the book there's a lovely moment where they're just on this big adventure and then they just go back, and it's very sweet. It's a very nice chapter, and it happens around Christmas, and I was like, ooh, this is seasonal and lovely and unexpected. So obviously while I kind of know the tone of this and I knew the characters and I knew the plot pretty much before going in, I'm still enjoying like discovering like a little bit more of this world. And like the surprises along the way have been quite nice, and the illustrations are gorgeous. So I do recommend this edition if you're a fan of the book or have just never read it before and would like to. So that was my November wrap up. As always, please let me know if you've read any of the books that I talked about and what you thought of them. I'm always happy to know. I always like to know. I'm very nosy. I'm a very nosy person. So just chat to me in the comments about books and I'll be happy. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye.